on to Sundry News for Wednesday, July 1st. Anyway, we begin today with Conservative Review. Here are the top stories. More evidence that most coronavirus cases are now weaker than the flu. Evidence continues to mount that the new infections throughout much of the country are extremely mild, with the exception of some serious cases coming over the border from Mexico. There you go. Noted environmentalist pens article apologizing for climate scare foisted on public for decades, but piece is taken down reportedly just hours later. Climate change is happening. It's just not the end of the world. It's not even our most serious environmental problem. Listen, the truth about Black Lives Matter. Violent, radical, racist, anti-Semitic, and neo-Marxist. Today I'm joined by filmmaker and investigative journalist Ami Horowitz, who discusses his experience inside some of the BLM riots. Child sexually assaulted in Minnesota park where neighbors swore off calling the police. Oh, that's nice. The neighborhood boycotted the cops. You got something to say, little boy? Older woman gets right back in leftist punk's face after he orders her to check your fucking privilege. That's how it's done. Okie dokie. Do I want to click on anything? Click on this. From The Blaze, Michael Schellenberger is no slouch when it comes to environmental issues. Besides his TED Talks garnering more than 5 million views, he's a Green Book Award winner, a frequent contributor to publications such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Scientific American, and he also authored Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All, which was released Tuesday by HarperCollins. But Schellenberger said a Forbes article, On Behalf of Environmentalists, I Apologize for the Climate Scare, based on his new book, was censored soon after it went up Sunday. The Daily Wire reported that his piece was taken down from the Forbes website a few hours after it was published. The Forbes site on Tuesday showed where Schellenberger's article should be, but only says it's no longer active. The Blaze on Tuesday didn't immediately hear back from Forbes in regard to the reasons Schellenberger's article was removed or the reported time frame in which it was shuttered. But Schellenberger has a few ideas on why his article is no longer there. No book on the environment has ever been praised by a more prestigious group of scientists and scholars than Apocalypse Never, he wrote on Twitter, and no book has ever been more devastating to green alarmism. No wonder they're so terrified you'll read it. In a statement to the Daily Wire, which published his piece in its entirety, Schellenberger said, I am grateful that Forbes has been so committed to publishing a range of viewpoints, including ones that challenge the conventional wisdom, and was thus disappointed my editors removed my piece from the website. I believe Forbes is an important outlet for broadening environmental journalism beyond the overwhelmingly alarmist approach taken by most reporters, and look forward to contributing heterodoxical pieces on energy and the environment in the future. What does his article say? Here's how Schellenberger opens his article. On behalf of environmentalists everywhere, I would like to formally apologize for the climate scare we created over the last 30 years. Climate change is happening. It's just not the end of the world. It's not even our most serious environmental problem. He also says he feels an obligation to apologize for how badly we environmentalists have misled the public. Schellenberger then details a list of facts few people know. Humans are not causing a sixth mass extinction. The Amazon is not the lungs of the world. Climate change is not making natural disasters worse. Fires have declined 25% around the world since 2003. The amount of land we use for meat, humankind's biggest use of land, has declined by an area nearly as large as Alaska. The buildup of wood fuel and more houses near forests, not climate change, explain why there are more and more dangerous fires in Australia and California. Carbon emissions have been declining in rich nations including Britain, Germany, and France since the mid-70s. Adapting to life below sea level made the Netherlands rich, not poor. We produce 25% more food than we need, and food surpluses will continue to rise as the world gets hotter. Habitat loss and the direct killing of wild animals are bigger threats to species than climate change. Wood fuel is far worse for people and wildlife than fossil fuels. Preventing future pandemics requires more, not less, industrial agriculture. I know that the above facts will sound like climate denialism to many people, he adds, but that just shows the power of climate alarmism. More from Schellenberger's article. Some people will, when they read this, imagine that I'm some right-wing anti-environmentalist. I am not. At 17, I lived in Nicaragua to show solidarity with the Sandinista socialist revolution. At 23, I raised money for Guatemalan women's cooperatives. In my early 20s, I lived in the semi-Amazon doing research with small farmers fighting land invasions. At 26, I helped expose poor conditions at Nike factories in Asia. I became an environmentalist at 16 when I threw a fundraiser for Rainforest Action Network. At 27, I helped save the last unprotected ancient redwoods in California. In my 30s, I advocated renewables and successfully helped persuade the Obama administration to invest $90 billion into them. Over the last few years, I helped save enough nuclear plants from being replaced by fossil fuels to prevent a sharp increase in emissions. Until last year, I mostly avoided speaking out against the climate scare. Partly that's because I was embarrassed. After all, I am as guilty of alarmism as any other environmentalist. For years, I referred to climate change as an existential threat to human civilization and called it a crisis. But mostly I was scared. I remained quiet about the climate disinformation campaign because I was afraid of losing friends and funding. The few times I summoned the courage to defend climate science from those who misrepresented, I suffered harsh consequences, and so I mostly stood by and did next to nothing as my fellow environmentalists terrified the public. He also added some highlights from his new book. Factories and modern farming are the keys to human liberation and environmental progress. The most important thing for saving the environment is producing more food, particularly meat, on less land. Particularly meat. The most important thing for reducing air pollution and carbon emissions is moving from wood to coal to petroleum to natural gas to uranium. 100% renewables would require increasing the land used for energy from today's 0.5% to 50%. Ugh. We should want cities, farms, and power plants to have higher, not lower, power densities. Vegetarianism reduces one's emissions by less than 4%. Greenpeace didn't save the whales. Switching from whale oil to petroleum and palm oil did. Free-range beef would require 20 times more land and produce 300% more emissions. Greenpeace dogmatism worsened forest fragmentation of the Amazon. The colonialist approach to gorilla conservation in the Congo produced a backlash that may have resulted in the killing of 250 elephants. Oh my. Schellenberger writes toward the end of his piece, once you realize just how badly misinformed we have been, often by people with plainly unsavory or unhealthy motivations, it is hard not to feel duped. Very interesting. Do I want to click on this? I will click on this. Horowitz. More evidence that most coronavirus cases are now weaker than the flu. Evidence continues to mount that the new infections throughout much of the country are extremely mild, with the exception of some serious cases coming over the border from Mexico. Those two facts continue to be obscured from our policy debate over containing the virus in the southern states. The governors of California, Arizona, and Texas refuse to recognize that the mild nature of these cases is good news going forward, and they continue to ignore the threat of serious cases from the border. Distinguishing between the two phenomena has become difficult because the cause of both of them appears to have begun in late May and continued into June, especially in border states, which weren't hit hard to begin with, and therefore had little herd immunity to combat a new round of spread. Yeah. Weren't hit hard. Plus, we had so many people staying home that any little bit of herd immunity we could have garnered is non-existent. But the timing of these serious cases at the border combined with milder cases in the interior seems to make it clear that we are seeing two distinct waves, the second and mild American wave, and the importation of Mexico's first, more serious wave. In my previous article, I focused on the serious cases coming from the border. That issue appears to be confined to certain hospitals in the border states. What about all other cases throughout the country? They are turning out to be less potent than even the flu. Increasing evidence that the new wave is mild for most of the country. As I pointed out regarding Florida, cases have been spiking for weeks, yet the deaths and numbers of serious cases are not rising. That dichotomy is perfectly illustrated in this graphic. States reported 575 U.S. COVID-2 deaths today. That's the lowest Tuesday figure since March 24th and down from last week's 703. The 7-day average falls to 525. Updated U.S. 7-day average cases versus deaths graph, which highlights the cases upturn beginning around June 9th. The CDC reports mean time from symptom onset to death of about 14 days. Cases are now skewing younger and milder, but still no deaths curve inflection despite the marked increase. So the blue line is cases 7-day average. The orange line is deaths 7-day average. Very good. Also, much of the increase is superficial and illusory because of mass testing, multiple tests to return to work, and people coming back to the hospitals for normal care that was previously suspended. Such patients are automatically tested for the virus regardless of their reason for admission. It appears that the virus has now spread to younger people, but is also milder than it was when it first hit in earnest in March and April. This reality is borne out by a fascinating data point about positive cases and Hispanic people. As of the week of April 25th, according to the CDC, just 12.2% of the cases were among those identified as Hispanic. As of yesterday, 34.4% of all cases were among Hispanics. That is simply astounding. If you peel into some state data, you will find that cases among Hispanics compose 46% in Florida, twice their share of the population. 46% of cases in North Carolina, nearly 5 times their share of the population, 35% in Tennessee, nearly 7 times their share of the population, and 24% of cases in Arkansas, nearly 3 times their share of the population. Those numbers are astounding. But what is even more shocking is that while Hispanics compose 34.4% of confirmed positive cases, they account for just 17.7% of the fatalities, more line with their share of the national population. More in line with their share of the national population. For example, in North Carolina, where they compose 46% of all cases, they account for just 9% of the deaths. What gives? The only logical answer is that this is merely an illusion of mass testing of meatpacking plants and farm labor camps, where they began testing every worker, most of whom are Hispanic, especially in the southern states. Thus, as we saw with the Arkansas Tyson Foods plants, almost all of them are asymptomatic. Lots of cases, few deaths. Why does there appear to be resurgence even beyond the accounting gimmicks? That could either be the next evolution of the virus itself, or due to the mass protests and rioting, there is increasing evidence of the latter. Either way, it makes sense that it would hit in states like California, Texas, and Florida, large states that were previously barely touched by the first round, and not in the Northeast, which has likely achieved some degree of de facto herd immunity. While there is still very little data quantifying who has a severe case or a mild case and who was hospitalized for coronavirus versus hospitalized with coronavirus discovered through testing, here are 2 powerful anecdotes that drive home both points. Car crashes are now COVID-19 cases. Well, it's been that way for a while. The New York Times reported on Sunday, 1/3 of all patients admitted to Miami's main public hospital over the past 2 weeks after going to the emergency room for car crash injuries and other urgent problems have tested positive for the coronavirus. That is huge news that most people are not properly dissecting. Car crashes plummeted by as much as 75% in some states during the shutdown because the roads were empty. Now we are back up to normal levels of car crashes. For that matter, hospitals are now back up to normal levels of cancer, heart, stroke, and any number of procedures and treatments that were either suspended or declined because people were too scared to come in. Now that we have universal testing in the hospitals, we are merely discovering what already existed, but we never detected because hospitals were empty and we did not have universal testing capability. These are people who would never have known they had COVID-19, much less rushed to the emergency room if not for the coincidence of their car accident or other ailment driving them into the hospital. Once they test positive, they are regarded as coronavirus patients, even if they are asymptomatic, which is the case with the majority of younger people who contract the virus. What percentage of people counted as COVID-19 patients came because of COVID-19 versus what percentage happened to have it asymptomatically? We don't know, but the number has to be pretty substantial. Cold-like symptoms as the new panic and threshold to trigger shutdown. What about those people coming to the hospital because of COVID-19? Most Americans probably conjure up images of people coming in with their lungs filled with fluid and suffering from acute respiratory distress syndrome, as we saw in New York in late March. That was never the case in most parts of the country, but it most certainly is not what's happening now. I long suspected, given the massive gap between deaths/ICU admissions versus hospitalizations and cases, that these cases were much milder, which leads me to the second anecdote. An emergency care executive from Texas explained to former New York Times reporter Alex Berenson that most cases he sees now in Texas are milder than a typical full-blown cold. The managing partner and general counsel of the company that owns Complete Care, which operates 13 emergency care clinics in Texas, emailed Berenson with a statement illuminating the situation on the ground. Tweet. Wondering what's really happening in Texas? Here's the email from a senior executive at a Texas ER chain that sees thousands of patients a month. He went on the record, a brave move. I'm going to let him speak for himself. 2 tweets of screenshots worth reading to the end. He noted that out of 2,231 tests the clinics have administered in June, although the positivity rate is at 20%, the vast majority of the cases are mild to very mild symptoms. He observed that most patients were in their 30s. Most would not even have met the criteria for testing during the peak when kits were scarce, and that very few of them really need hospitalization. Vast majority of the patients are better within 2 to 3 days of the visit, and most would be described as having a cold, a mild one at that, or the symptoms related to allergies, he said. He further noted that half of them come in because they sneeze or cough and their employer makes them get tested. Thus, ironically, the spike in hospitalizations now is because of the previous lockdown, which they are now pushing again. As Dr. Robert Hancock of Texas College of Emergency Physicians said, we saw just a rash of people that came in for relatively treatable conditions that had just waited to the point that it deteriorated. That's kind of added to the ICU stress on top of just having the COVID-19 patients. Thus, what we are seeing in Texas and elsewhere is actually a fulfillment of what we all hoped for. A flattened curve of mild cases in hospitals that are able to handle severe cases, but ultimately few deaths. Overall, based upon what we are seeing at our facilities, the above information is really more of a positive story, wrote the emergency clinic executive to Berenson. You have more people who are testing positive with minimal symptoms. This means that the fatality rate is less than commonly reported. This is perhaps why hospital officials in Texas, whose profession has typically led the charge in panic peddling since March, are actually warning the public that they are being misled with illusory data. Houston Methodist CEO Mark Boom complained that the data is being misinterpreted, and quite frankly, we're concerned that there is a level of alarm in the community that is unwarranted right now. Exactly. Thank you. We do have the capacity to care for many more patients and have lots of fluidity and ability to manage, Boom said in a press conference with the CEOs of Houston's largest hospitals as he pointed out the missing context the media and politicians are failing to provide. He pointed out that this time last year, ICU capacity was at 95%. If anything, what was occurring in April was abnormal because everyone was scared away from hospitals, and that was not a good thing. As the media continues to be addicted to spinning bad news, it's incumbent upon everyone else to provide the missing context. Back. Moving on to the Daily Wire. Father of black teen killed in CHOP, Capitol Hill occupied protest. It's time to bring in the National Guard. Agreed. Pharrell Williams criticizes July 4th, otherwise known as Independence Day, calls for reparations. We deserve that. No, you don't. Read it. Atlanta detective sides with officer in defense filing for Rayshard Brooks case. says Brooks would have been charged on 10 counts. Terry Crews faces backlash for saying Black Lives Matter shouldn't turn into Black Lives Better. It already has, dude. Where have you been? MLB player talks league racism, playing by white America's rules in post-announcing departure. Okay. Daily Wire. Come work with us. Few openings. Cool. Ben's latest op-ed. Truly we live in auspicious times. Those who have sinned will be cast down. Those who are sinless will set new social standards for the rest of us. After all, we now live in the only generation ever to produce truly virtuous human beings. There's a bunch of ads to look at. Am I going to click on any of these? Fuck you, Pharrell. Let's